I hope you are all enjoying this evening of peace. We appreciate your support and hope that you will be inspired by the evening. Tonight is a special night. We honor Noam Chomsky.
Well, it's superfluous for me to say how much I'm honored and pleased to receive this distinguished award and to be able to join the wonderful list of people, my friend Dan Ellsberg and others who've contributed so much to the difficult, ongoing, necessary search for peace and justice. On an occasion like this, what instantly and forcefully comes to mind is August 6, 1945, a day that will never be forgotten by those who were alive then and had their eyes open, a day that I personally remember all too well. If I can add a personal anecdote, I, at that time, was a counselor in a summer camp. The news came in the morning to the assembled campers and counselors, and then everyone went off to their usual activities, a baseball game, whatever it might be. I was so stunned by it, both by the event and the reaction, that I simply took off and went off into the woods and stayed alone for 3 or 4 hours, just thinking about what it all meant. Finally came back, and those two, what David calls that terrible silence in one of his evocative poems, was overwhelming. And since that time, these two demons are haunting over everything that goes on in one form or another, both the event and the terrible silence. And I'm sure all of you are haunted in one form or another by the same two demons. It was on that day that we learned that human intelligence had devised the means to bring the human experiment of 200,000 years to an inglorious end. It was never seriously in doubt that the capacity to destroy would escalate and that it would diffuse to many other hands, increasing the threat of self-annihilation. On that day in 1945, humanity entered into a new era, the nuclear age, one that's unlikely to last very long. Either we will soon bring it to an end, or it's likely to bring us to an end. It was not understood at the time, but a second and no less critical new era was beginning at the same time, a new geological epoch, what geologists call the Anthropocene, an epoch defined by extreme human impact on the environment. By now it's understood that we're well into this new epoch, but there has been disagreement among scientists about when changes became so extreme, when was the kind of point of inflection to signal its onset. A couple of months ago, the official working group on the Anthropocene reached a conclusion on the matter, recommending to the International Geological Congress that the dawn of the Anthropocene should be given the same date, the end of World War II, August 1945. According to their analysis then, the Anthropocene and the nuclear age coincide, posing a dual threat to the perpetuation of organized human life. Both threats are severe and imminent, and neither receives a fraction of the attention it demands. Without exaggeration, we might identify the end of World War II as the moment when the lemmings in human form set off on their determined and disciplined march to the precipice. That kind of thought is what I found terrifying while sitting alone in the woods in August 1945, and now we know how much more serious it is. And it is impressive to watch how dedicated this march to self-destruction is. We've just been witnessing a remarkable demonstration of the dedication to this vocation. For the past several months, all eyes have been on the quadrennial electoral frenzy to determine who will lead the most powerful country in human history, the country that will set its stamp on what comes to pass. Issues, as you know, are barely discussed at all, and there has been scarcely a mention of the most important question that has arisen in all of human history, and that has to be answered very soon. Is organized human life going to survive? On the growing threat, and it is growing, of nuclear war and on nuclear policies generally, there have been a few scattered phrases which are hardly encouraging. On destruction of the environment, one of the two political parties does, in fact, take a very clear position. We should do nothing, or it's not happening at all. During the Republican primaries, every single candidate denied that what is happening, with the exception of the sensible moderates, like Jeb Bush, who said that it's all uncertain, but we don't have to do anything because we're producing more natural gas thanks to fracking. Or John Kasich, the other moderate, who agreed that global warming is taking place, but added that, quoting him, "We're going to burn coal in Ohio, and we're not going to apologize for it. And in general, we should do nothing." The winning candidate, as you know, calls for rapid increase in use of fossil fuels, including coal, dismantling of all regulations, rejection of the commitment to help developing countries that are seeking to move to sustainable energy, and in general, racing to the cliff as fast as possible. And the effects have already been felt. The COP21 Paris negotiations agreement, they've just gone into force. The date was accelerated by concern that a Republican victory in November might dismantle what little has been achieved. And Republican denialism already had a significant impact. It was hoped that COP21 would lead to a verifiable treaty, but that hope was abandoned because the Republican Congress would not accept any binding commitments. So what emerged was a voluntary agreement, evidently much weaker. Just a couple of days ago, a significant agreement was reached to phase down the use of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, super polluting greenhouse gases, much worse than CO2. It is delayed for India and Pakistan, where increasing heat, which is making much of the country unlivable, and shocking poverty, make cheap air conditioners a desperate necessity. And the right response is quite evident. the rich countries should provide subsidies to accelerate the provision of advanced non-HFC devices, the ones we use here, very limited cost. But nothing like that seems to have been proposed, and if it were, it would go the way of a verifiable COP21 treaty. When you think about this, it's hard to find appropriate words to express the fact that in the most powerful country in world history, with a decisive impact on world affairs, a major political organization is quite literally dedicated to the destruction of much of life on Earth, including us. That might seem to be an unfair comment, but a little reflection will show that it is not. And worse still, these astonishing facts pass with virtually no comment. The twin demons again. Well, I won't take time to sample the record, familiar to you, I'm sure, and not our topic here, but it's nevertheless worth at least recalling how imminent and dramatic the problem is. So let's just take one example that's not much discussed. Every year, about 25 million people flee from the effect of disasters such as floods and storms, the predicted effect of global warming. That's one person every second, considerably more than the miserable victims fleeing from war and terror. And the numbers are bound to increase with the rise of sea levels, very likely not far off. Very recently, as you may have read, and particularly ominous, are recent discoveries about the rate of melting of the huge Antarctic glaciers, which could raise sea levels by several feet quite quickly. In Bangladesh alone, mostly a low-lying coastal plain, tens of millions are expected to be forced to flee in coming decades simply because of sea level rise. With some justice, Bangladesh's leading climate scientist says that these migrants should have the right to move to the countries from which all these greenhouse gases have been coming. Millions should be able to go to the United States alone. All of this is a coming so-called refugee crisis that makes today's pale into insignificance, and it's also a profound moral crisis for the rich societies, which will only intensify as Himalayan glaciers melt, already happening, threatening the water supply of South Asia. We're already hundreds of millions of people lack adequate drinking water. But all of this, and far more, does not even reach the sidelines while the game of triviality and vulgarity commands obsessive attention. And when we turn to our topic here, the picture's not more encouraging. It should be an imperative for an educated citizen, any educated citizen, to review carefully the history of the nuclear age. It's a harrowing experience for anyone who's willing to endure the painful record of missed opportunities and near misses, sometimes from accident and error, in a few shocking cases that are not well enough known, from recklessness. And the threat is growing right now ominously. Escape from catastrophe for 70 years has been a near miracle, and such miracles cannot be trusted to perpetuate. New information is appearing regularly about how lucky we are to have survived so far. As I'm sure you all know, the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has been moved 2 minutes closer to midnight, to the point 3 minutes to midnight, where it last was in the early 1980s, during a major war scare, about which we have recently, very recently, learned more. So to recall the basic facts, in 1983, the Reagan administration launched what was called Operation Able Archer to probe Russian defenses, simulating attacks on Russia, including nuclear attacks. It happened to be a moment of grave international tensions. Among other threat escalations, Pershing II nuclear missiles were being installed in Germany with a short flight time, a few minutes to Russian territory. And we now know, didn't know this before, that Soviet specialists feared that they had a range of 2,500 kilometers, which would have posed a direct threat to the leadership in Moscow. At the same time, Griffin cruise missiles, although slower, could reach Moscow and also could fly low enough to avoid Soviet radar, leaving the Soviet nuclear command vulnerable to a decapitating first strike. I'm actually quoting from a new study by the National Security Archive, which has significant new information about Able Archer. A couple of years ago, with the declassification of Russian archives, it was learned that, not too surprisingly, the Russians took Able Archer pretty seriously. There has been uncertainty, however, about how much was understood in Washington. The National Security Archive has been trying for many years to have the record declassified, and they've now partially succeeded. The record reveals that Washington recognized very quickly that Able Archer was bringing the world to the verge of terminal war. A presidential board was established, which concluded right away that the CIA had been mistaken in its judgment that the Russians recognized Able Archer to be just an exercise. On quite the contrary, I'll quote the words of the board, the Russians took Able Archer so seriously that it may have inadvertently placed our relations with the Soviet Union on a hair trigger. That means we were on the verge of nuclear war, which of course means terminal nuclear war, terminal for everyone. These newly released documents have other revelations. They reveal that U.S. intelligence determined that the Russians were mobilizing forces to what they call an unusual level of alert, which according to protocol, U.S. protocol, meant that the U.S. should have reacted in kind. One high U.S. Air Force officer, Leonard Perutz, decided on his own not to follow prescribed procedures and to do nothing, as the record says, perhaps averting terminal war. We already knew that shortly after this, Russian automated systems detected a massive U.S. nuclear attack, and the officer in charge, Stanislav Petrov, also decided to do nothing, instead of transmitting the information to a higher level, which might have triggered a massive nuclear strike. So Perutz and Petrov, therefore, belong to the honor roll of men who decided that the species should survive, joining Vasily Arkhipov, who blocked orders to launch nuclear torpedoes, nuclear-tipped torpedoes, when Russian submarines were under attack during a very tense moment of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which could have easily had escalating effects without limit. No doubt there are others whose names are unknown. I've just been reading drafts of Dan Ellsberg's long-awaited book on nuclear strategy, which he was kind enough to send me, though I'm not sure that kind is the right word. It's an appalling record, beginning early on. Dan may be talking about it himself, so I won't say much. But one of the most frightening parts is Dan's 1960 inquiries into the sophisticated fail-safe mechanisms that had been devised to prevent accidental launch of nuclear weapons by pilots. And Dan, for the first time, undertook to investigate these mechanisms at forward air bases. And he was able to show that also, although they might have looked good on paper, in practice, the mechanisms had fatal flaws, and pilots were in fact ready to launch a nuclear war under circumstances that were not at all unlikely to arise. This adds another chapter to the horrifying record of near misses and missed opportunities. And that record was already appalling enough, including fatal flaws of command and control that could have been terminal. Some of them are recounted in a memoir by B-52 pilot, Major Don Clausen. He took part in the missions, the Chrome Dome missions, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a mission of B-52s on airborne alert with, I'm quoting him, nuclear weapons on board and ready to use. His own conclusion is that we were damned lucky that we didn't blow up the world, and no thanks to the political or military leadership of this country. Clausen reports that he flew 15 24-hour Chrome Dome missions, and that the official commanders, I'm quoting him, did not possess the capability to prevent a rogue crew or crew member from arming and releasing their thermonuclear weapons, or even from broadcasting a mission that would have sent off the entire airborne alert force without possibility of recall. And once the crew was airborne, carrying thermonuclear weapons, he writes, it would have been possible to arm and drop them all with no further input from the ground. There was no inhibitor on any of these systems. SAC, the Strategic Air Command, was technically in charge, but appears to have had little control. And the deciders, so-called, who were pondering the fate of the world at the XCOM meetings in Washington, apparently knew even less. That's a conclusion that is underscored rather bitterly in an oral history of this period by General David Birchinall, who commanded the operation. His attitude toward the civilian leaders is pretty shocking, maybe justified. Well, I was pretty skeptical when I read Major Clausen's account, but skepticism fades pretty rapidly when, after reading Dan's chilling discoveries about sub-delegation of authority, much of it authorized directly by President Eisenhower and presumably by his successors, who are much less knowledgeable about military affairs than he was. It's on such decisions that the fate of organized human society has relied all too often in the nuclear age, and it simply cannot go on. But it is going on, in fact, with mounting threats, partly in Syria, where proposals by John McCain and Clinton advisors, Michel Flournoy and Mike Morrell, if they were implemented, it could easily lead to uncontrollable escalation. But the main tensions are on the Russian border, with highly provocative actions on both sides, along with ominous military buildups. One can only imagine with trepidation the command and control flaws that might suddenly become lethal any minute, literally. Jets, military jets buzzing each other, and all provocative military actions a couple hundred meters from the Russian border and so on. Notice that all of this is at the Russian border. It's not at the Mexican border, where even the remotest hint of such a threat would have led to nuclear war long ago, and we'd be done. We should at least be asking why the threats are at the Russian border, and more generally, what were the opportunities for a global security system with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991? Well, the two sides at the time had conflicting visions. Gorbachev, for the Russians, called for dismantling of all military alliances and replacing them by a unified Eurasian security system which would integrate the former Soviet Union, collapsing at the time, and Western Europe. On the other side, President Bush and his Secretary of State, James Baker, had a different plan. NATO would expand while the Soviet system collapsed. What happened at the time has been the subject of a very interesting and searching scholarly inquiry, and there are some new and quite revealing discoveries. The issue, of course, was joined over the fate of Germany for obvious reasons. Gorbachev did agree to German unification, even German accession to NATO, a hostile military alliance, which is a pretty remarkable concession in the light of recent history. After all, earlier in the century, Germany alone had practically destroyed Russia twice, long history before that. But he did agree. There was, however, a quid pro quo. NATO would not extend 1 inch to the east. That's the phrase that was used in the negotiations. That meant to East Germany. There was no discussion of anything beyond, and if it was contemplated, it was only in secret on the US side. Well, Bush and Baker agreed to this, but only verbally. It was a gentleman's agreement, a handshake, not in writing. And NATO instantly expanded to East Germany in violation of the pledge. But as Bush and Baker correctly stated, they were not violating a written commitment, just a gentleman's agreement. Well, there's a rich scholarly literature seeking to determine exactly what was going on at the time. And there has been one primary open question that's been debated. What is it that Bush and Baker intended in doing this? There's actually a persuasive answer to this question that's just been given, a very recent article in the MIT Harvard Journal, International Security, by Joshua Itzkowitz-Shifrinson. Did a lot of new archival studies, and they indicate pretty clearly that the Bush-Baker verbal commitments to Gorbachev were very explicitly designed to mislead Gorbachev while U.S. dominance extended to the east. It's a matter of some significance that shouldn't be confined to the dry prose of a scholarly journal. Well, under Clinton, NATO expanded farther to the east in 2008. Apparently later, NATO even offered membership to Ukraine, a highly provocative move, right at the geostrategic heartland of Russia, quite apart from long historical and cultural connections. George Kennan and other senior statesmen had warned right at the beginning that NATO enlargement would be what they called a tragic mistake, a policy error of historic proportions. It's now contributing to rising tensions on the Russian border, raising a risk of nuclear war that is not slight. The options in 1991 were another in a long series of missed opportunities to move from confrontation to cooperation, opening ways to eliminate the scourge of nuclear weapons entirely, and also to move on to a more peaceful world. It's not the only case, and some of the earlier ones from very early in the Cold War and since offer quite suggestive lessons for today. One of the most intriguing was an offer by Stalin in 1952 to permit unification of Germany on condition that it not join NATO, and perhaps leading to elections that were certain to have inclined Germany to the West. At the time, the most vocal support for exploring the opportunity was by a very respected and influential analyst, James Warburg, in his book, Germany, Key to Peace. He was ignored, and the scattered later references to this have mostly elicited ridicule, as I found myself several times. Declassification of Russian archives a couple of years ago has led to some serious rethinking of this matter. One of the leading scholars of the Soviet Union, bitterly anti-communist Soviet scholar Adam Ulam, he observed that, and quote him, after the archives came out, Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing, as in fact Warburg had shown right at the time. Ulam's own judgment is that what he calls the basic question remains open. Was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the newly created German Democratic Republic, East Germany, on the altar of real democracy, with consequences that could have been enormous? Cold War historian Melvin Leffler, one of the most distinguished Cold War historians, also citing Russian archives, points out that Lavrenti Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the secret police, proposed that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on the unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions and improve internal political and economic conditions in Russia. There's a spate of recent scholarship cited by these Russian archival releases, which has sought to show that Stalin never meant what he proposed. There was a good way to find out at the time, to take him up on the proposal, but that was not seriously tried. And to my knowledge, scholarly inquiry has focused on whether Stalin was serious, and not on a question more significant to us. Why was there no effort to find out? And it's not the only time by any means. This raises an interesting question highly relevant to nuclear destruction. At the time, the United States basically faced no threats, but there was a potential threat. ICBMs with hydrogen bomb warheads, not yet developed by, say, 1950, but in the offing. And that raises a question whether there could have been a treaty negotiation with the Russians which would have eliminated the only serious threat to the security of the United States and, in fact, the survival of the world. There's an interesting study of this by McGeorge Bundy, the standard scholarly study of the history of nuclear weapons, and he does devote 2 or 3 sentences to it in the middle of the book. He points out that he had access to high-level classified material. He said he could not find even a staff paper raising the question whether there should be an effort to eliminate the only potential serious threat to U.S. security and survival. It's not the only case. One of the striking features of the Pentagon Papers Dan released is that you find cases like this over and over? Well, there have been other opportunities. How real, we don't know. They weren't seriously explored. They provide a historical counterpoint to the abysmal record of incidents that were much too close to disaster to be tolerable, and both missed opportunities and threatening provocations are all too real today, posing challenges that should be the focus of concern for populations, policymakers alike, and certainly for all of us who hope to escape the threats, pursue the opportunities. The goal of abolishing nuclear weapons is not a utopian dream. It's been forcefully advocated by mainstream establishment figures, among them George Shultz, Sam Nunn, Henry Kissinger, William Perry, four signers of an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal calling for elimination of weapons altogether. Another respected national security expert, Bruce Blair, has formed a new organization called Global Zero, which calls for an international treaty banning nuclear weapons. The International Court of Justice came close to that stand in its 1996 advisory opinion on the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. This month, for the first time, the United Nations is considering a resolution to launch negotiations, I'll quote, on a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination. The resolution is sponsored by Brazil, Austria, Ireland, Mexico, Nigeria, South Africa, and it's expected to win the support of more than 120 states. But without large-scale public support, it will pass into oblivion, just like the other lost opportunities. And the same holds regarding the steps that should be taken right now to reduce the international tensions that are escalating the threat of nuclear war. There are steps that can be taken, that must be taken, if we are to dispel the oncoming storm that may consume us all.
On behalf of the Foundation, I want to thank Professor Chomsky for accepting the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award this evening and for his powerful talk. Let me take you back for just a minute to about 2,400 years ago. It's a long time, but it's when Alexander the Great ruled in the 4th century BC. He spent most of his ruling years at war. And if he had decided at that time to spend $1 million per day, every single day, up until today, on his war efforts, he still would not have spent $1 trillion. Yet that's how much the US plans to spend on modernizing its nuclear arsenal over the next 30 years. Think about that, $1 million per day for over 2,400 years, and it still wouldn't equal our nuclear weapons budget for the next 30 years. It's staggering, and it's a frightening statistic. At NAPF, we believe that we as a people need to humanize, not modernize. Modernize sounds nice, right? But what's it mean? It means new nuclear warheads, nuclear-armed submarines, land-based missiles, bomber aircraft, some of which are proposed to be deployed until the 2080s. It means smaller, more precise weapons that many argue can be considered more usable on the battlefield, lowering the threshold for nuclear weapons use. It means many of our country's top scientific minds will be focused on mass destruction. Now imagine a world in which the US and the world's other 8 nuclear-armed nations directed their nuclear weapons funding instead to address human needs. We could provide tens of thousands of scholarships for young people to attend college. I think there's a few people here tonight who might think that's a good idea. We could transform our fossil fuel economy in order to stave off the worst effects of man-made climate change. We could pay more for teachers and even pay them what they're worth. Yeah. My daughter's elementary school right here in Santa Barbara might have to lay off its librarian this year. It's not okay. So I could probably name 1 trillion ways in which this money could be better spent. But the point is this: if the US doesn't stop modernizing and take seriously its legal and its moral obligations to negotiate in good faith for nuclear disarmament, neither will the other 8 nations. We've got to work toward total global nuclear disarmament. And here at NAPF, we never lose sight of our mission to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. We also actively oppose each nuclear modernization program as it rears its ugly head in Congress. There's no up and down vote on whether to spend $1 trillion. It comes in many pieces over many years, and we need your support to keep it from moving ahead. Now, Professor Chomsky relayed some shocking information tonight in his talk. And now that you know, I ask you to please join us. Sign up for our Action Alert Network at wagingpeace.org or at our information table in the back of the room. Share the information from our website or information that you pick up here with your friends and family. At the opening of his talk tonight, Noam Chomsky said that we will soon bring the nuclear age to an end, or it will bring an end to us. So will we modernize our nuclear weapons, or will we humanize our society and make the world a better place for everyone? We can't have it both ways. Thank you all again, and good night.